Dr. Covello, thank you for your opportunity and the presentation you just gave us. There's a few questions that I heard in the audience that I'd like to take the opportunity to ask you. Sure. First relates to practice and preparation. You talked about the importance of what Mayor Giuliani did in the 1990s to prepare for the ultimate attack. Right. The truth is, how do you best prepare in an organization? Is it conducting a risk management analysis or a risk assessment? But how do you make the preparation really beneficial?
Well, there's several steps involved in preparation for high concern communication. The first obviously is the issue. Sometimes the issue is given to you, and sometimes you have to identify what that issue is. And there are various names given to that process, such as vulnerability analysis, to predict, anticipate risk, or anticipate crisis beforehand. Then you have to identify who the primary stakeholder is of the issue. Why? Because in communication, it's almost impossible to be effective without a primary stakeholder in mind. The third step of the process is to identify the concerns of the stakeholder. So part of preparation is to identify the full set of concerns of a particular stakeholder for a particular issue. And that's where things start getting rather complicated. For example, in our most recent studies of nuclear power plant accidents, we found that the stakeholders, first of all, are multiple. They include villains, victims, and heroes. They include the media, the politicians. They include the public at large. They include the people who were affected directly by the accident. And our research indicates that in the three major accidents that have happened since in the last 100 years related to nuclear power, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, and Fukushima, that there's 420 questions that the public asks, 420 questions they will ask of the authorities, which includes the nuclear power plant itself, the politicians, the scientists, etc. And that's actually a fairly conservative number related to the number of questions that stakeholders have for virtually any issue. So the first task is to identify the issue, number two, the stakeholder, and third, to identify a comprehensive list of the questions or concerns of the stakeholder. Another example, we did a study for the EPA on the cleanup, and we found that the public has 103 questions whenever there's a cleanup, the public at large, let alone, let's say, a resident. For water contamination, we found there's 205 questions people ask whenever the water is contaminated with something. So now how you get that, first you have to look back at history. You have to go back and see what are questions people have asked before. That's the first database, the well from which you draw. Second is you speak to informants, people involved in the issue. And number three, you do empathic thinking. You simply try to put yourself in the shoes of the stakeholder and say, what would I be concerned about if I was, for example, had a drug that was just recalled, or if I was, someone wants to do drilling on my property, whatever it may be, you try to put yourself in your shoes to determine what they would be thinking. So that's the first three steps. Now, to anticipate, then you have to start developing the answers or the responses to those questions. And that's where a whole slew of what are called templates come involved, that come from the behavioral science literature, such as compassion, conviction, optimism, or 1 negative equals 3 positives, or templates such as the I don't know template. Because for each question, you have to develop an answer that's consistent with best practice in behavioral science literature. This usually produces a briefing book of the prepared responses to the anticipated questions for a specific stakeholder for a particular issue. Now you've got a briefing book. Now the next step of preparation is you have to practice. It's simply not enough to have it, that everyone has to be able to internalize those messages so that they believe the messages, they become an advocate for the messages, consistent with the new model that you have, that we want to make sure that people believe what they're reading, they have actions that relate to it, they can now advocate the position being taken. But that usually requires a great deal of practice, given especially that many of these templates are not natural, they're not instinctive. For example, when a scientist gets challenged on a fact, they often want to start off with a fact. Here are the facts. While the psychology of dealing with a high concern question is to start with empathy and caring. We often feel we can balance, for example, a negative with 1 positive, but the research indicates that you need 3 positives in order to offset any negative. And so these are not natural, instinctive approaches. Although one thing I found exciting about being here at the conference is that in many ways I'm simply reinforcing what many of those who are very experienced already know. They know, for example, that people want to know that you care before they care what you know. They know that people have limited ability to process information in high stress situations. They know that it takes 3 or more positives to offset a negative. So I'm simply reinforcing things they already know, or in some cases, if the person has not well worked in communication before, I'm sharing with them new knowledge.